Chris, do you have a unit yet?
Yep.
Yeah, sweet.
Yeah, I got it right here.
Okay, yours is the full size one. This is the baby one for my 2-year-old.
Oh, cool. I didn't know there was different sizes. Nice.
There typically isn't. I just have a plethora of old bags from years past. So I made one for my little guy.
That's awesome. Yeah. I just got mine in a few weeks ago, but I'm down in Naples, Florida, and we've had a bunch of hurricanes. So I haven't had much of a chance to use it yet. So I'm really excited to dive into it.
Yeah.
So for my listeners, can we just start off with talking about like what exactly Isocapnic is and what is the main goal of the product?
Yeah, so Isocapnic is a scientific term for the controlling of CO2, carbon dioxide. And so when we set out on the goal to challenge the respiratory system, that challenge stems from gas exchange. If I were to say take a deep breath, you could probably take 1 or 2 deep breaths, no problem. If you were to take 10 or 15 or 20 breaths in a row, you probably feel pretty lightheaded. And so that's the problem that we needed to overcome, was solving the issue of hyperventilation. So that's what our device does, is that it recaptures your exhaled gases, maintaining an isocapnic environment. And so we can keep your CO2 level stable, so you can breathe as hard and as fast and as powerfully as you possibly can, all without hyperventilation.
Okay, so as part of that, like an imbalance of CO2 and O2, is that what creates the lightheadedness too? I'm very curious about that.
Yeah. So your body doesn't have any sensors in it telling yourself how high or low your oxygen levels are, but it has very sensitive organs telling you where your CO2 is at. If your CO2 drops a little bit too low, your body freaks out. If your CO2 goes a little bit too high, it freaks out. So it needs to maintain this normal range, this middle range. It's called normal capnea, and it keeps that's where your CO2 has to be. If it goes if your CO2 levels drop too high, one of the first things your body does is vasodilate out, and it pools your blood. It tries to dilute the amount of CO2 with more blood volume. The problem is if you go too far with that, then that low pressure actually then has the blood fall out of your head. And so you lose consciousness that way. Same thing, if your CO2 levels drive down too low, one of the first things that happens is vasoconstriction. So it pushes blood volume out to, again, try to maintain the concentration of CO2. And if it does that hard enough, then it strangles you from the inside out. And so then again, blood to your heart, to your head. So that's why you get lightheaded, whether it's too high or too low.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. And so those chemoreceptors that can sense your CO2, there's plasticity to them, right? That's what the CO2 tolerance is training that ability to your body's ability to perceive how much CO2 there is, or tolerate, I should say, is the better word. Yeah,
I mean, the plasticity of your chemoreceptors is a little bit unproven right now. The working hypothesis that we have for understanding why Wim Hof has such great tolerance versus like the average Joe is more to do with the tonality of the epithelial cells of your of your veins. And so if you don't ever challenge the range of high or low CO2, your body will do whatever's easiest. It's not going to maintain this ability to become really vasodilated or really vasoconstricted if it doesn't ever need it. And so as you challenge that system more, you get better tonality of those epithelial cells, and you can vasodilate more, and you can vasoconstrict more than the average person, meaning you can maintain normal capnea in terms of concentration longer.
Okay. So just like any other system of the body, it'll adapt to whatever stimulus you put upon it or don't put upon it in either direction.
Exactly. Yeah. The body is incredibly trainable, and this is one of the aspects that we can use to train it.
Yeah. My first thought is I wonder what kind of effect this has on systolic and diastolic pressure when you use it long term. I mean, there's got to be some positive benefit there.
Yeah, I mean, we're really scratching the surface of the whole wellness side of the coin. I mean, the wellness industry has been after this idea for a long time, but we're in talks right now with universities on doing studies on this, and that's why, I like to be like perfectly transparent with the cutting edge of the science that we're a part of, and the whole idea of CO2 tolerance is on that cutting edge.
Yeah.
As athletes and as wellness practitioners, we like to sort of like be on that leading edge, and some people are a little bit beyond it, which can be good or bad depending on your level of caution there beyond.
Yeah, so I'm just getting to know your company a little bit, and my impression is that you developed a product for basically athletes and optimization, and sort of stumbled into, well, hold on, we have all kinds of rehab potential here. Am I correct there? Yeah.
Yeah. So like a little bit of background on us, like, I grew up as a downhill ski racer in school, and I got into endurance sport in university, and did high performance professional level triathlon for a number of decades. And I really got into coaching, and really got into exercise physiology and helping athletes like really understand how and why they can get better. Through that system that we developed, we created a testing protocol where we could find the nuances of what systems are strong and what systems are weak. And so we could objectively tell an athlete, like, oh, your cardiac system needs work in this way, or your respiratory system needs work in this way, or your metabolic system, or your energetics, or whatever. We could use technology to objectively identify what systems are strong and what systems are weak. And this is different to typical testing protocols, where it's like a VO2 max style test, where you're kind of just benchmarking the system. We're not really teasing out what systems are causing the cascading of second threshold, for example.
Yeah.
So we were more interested in understanding, how does this information change your training tomorrow? And that's really what we have always aimed to do, was give you information that help training get better tomorrow, because you're now a smarter athlete because of that information.
Yeah, it seems like an untapped sort of metric. It seems like low-hanging fruit that just could easily be a hole in someone's game, and it just has not been like challenged in this way, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, when you like strength and conditioning athletes and coaches, this is no surprise to, because like it makes a lot of sense if you get an athlete into the gym and you identify that they have weak biceps, and you're like, oh, okay, you have weak biceps. So how you train that? Well, let's do some bicep curls. Let's do something that's going to challenge those muscular fibers so we can make them stronger. And in endurance world, that just hasn't been the norm. The norm has been, well, here's my 6-week program, here's my 12-week program, here's a program built for Ironman athletes or whatever. And like, we're throwing spaghetti at the wall, hoping that it sticks. And
Right.
I've always, been more attracted to the idea of training however your body needs to train to make the most of the time that you have to train. And so every single week we can sort of maximize the available time to train. So you're wasting less time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So can you describe like what the product is, like what it looks like, and how it actually works?
Sure. Yeah, I have an easy little one on screen here. Our typical bag color is blue. This is a little baby-sized bag for my 2-year-old. But we have the rebreather bag that is the same bag that you find in a operating room, and we have our manifold up top here that is the mixing chamber for your fresh air. So as you breathe into the system or into the bag recaptures about 90% of your exhaled gases and then vents off just the appropriate amount of CO2. As you breathe in that 90% from the bag and that little bit of the perfect amount of fresh air in. So you have this no moving parts mixing chamber here that's pulling in just the perfect amount of fresh air that your body stays stable, and you can do this indefinitely. And so you can now be at rest and breathe as if you are like running up an unending like flight of stairs, or you're doing hill repeats, or anywhere in between, where you can challenge the range of motion of your system, or the power of your system, or the endurance of that system, specifically to the respiratory muscles themselves. The reason why this is really like beneficial and important is that if we say identified that you had a respiratory limitation, which is like more than 70% of the people in the lab, the best way outside of using a device like this to train the respiratory system is to send you out and do like hill repeats, to drive metabolic load high enough that your respiratory system has to cope. And the problem with that is that we're adding all of this peripheral stress to the rest of your system to get the benefit of just the respiratory training that you're after. And so what we're proposing here is that if we identify that your respiratory system is limited, that why don't we spend the rest of your training doing things that are really beneficial for those muscles and do the specific training for your respiratory system that it needs. So that way you're not wasting time doing some surrogate work to doing the respiratory training. The parallel to this in the gym would be identifying somebody with biceps that are weak and doing squats because you're holding onto a bar and it happens to be somewhat being used in the middle of these squats. And it's the wrong, you're not actually working that effectively.
I see. So there's like a rate limiter and you can only go so far depending, and this is more meant to like isolate one specific system so that the other variables can't get in the way.
Yeah. Like a good sort of anecdotal story about this would be like working with like NHL hockey players. It is pretty normal for us to test like an NHL hockey player, and their upper threshold will be around 180 liters per minute that they have to breathe to do a shift on the ice. And in training, they never exceed this ability to breathe 180 liters, and in competition, they never exceed this ability to breathe 180 liters. So their system is governed by 180 liters per minute. We can now train those athletes off the ice to breathe 220, 250, 300 liters per minute so that the respiratory system is just not a limiting factor anymore. So then they go back to training or they go back to competition, that system now has that limiter removed, and that limiter can be something else. It could be your muscles, it could be your heart, it could be a plethora of other things, but at least now your respiratory system isn't the squeaky wheel.
That's fascinating. And I'm a beer league hockey player, so that immediately got my attention. And I can't wait to tell the guys in the locker room because they'll take any kind of advantage. So I imagine you'll see a uptick in performance because, I know it's like when you're gassed on the ice, then suddenly your stick handling goes plummets and everything goes, down the toilet. Yep. So I imagine you're going to see, at least anecdotally, increased performance.
It's huge. It's like for anything coordination based, like even running. I can tell you from like across the track, I can tell you the point at which an athlete loses their ability to breathe because their coordination to be able to run or stick handle on the ice is integral to their core stability. Mm-hmm. When people think core stability, they think their abs, their obliques, maybe their back muscles, but the musculature that is the closest to the spine is your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is this dome-shaped muscle that's at the bottom of your rib cage, and then it corkscrew twists around your spine. It is like integral to the stability of your spine. So if you lose your ability to control good, smooth breathing, you lose your core stability. And that's why your stick handling will fall apart. That's why your running ability will fall apart, and your core stability inevitably falls apart, is tied to that respiratory kind of piece of the puzzle.
No, that makes perfect sense. Do you see with athletes like specific adaptations? Do certain athletes, I imagine the answer is yes, have better lung capacity than others, or like who's like low on the end and who's high?
So I mean, I'm in an interesting position right now where I'm starting to test more with like hockey players and rugby players and golfers and like other sports where like I grew up in endurance sport. And so all of my background has been with athletes that are like on the spectrum of breathers are pretty good. Mm-hmm. And so we've built a system on making pretty good breathers really great breathers. And so testing like high level rugby players, for example, it's fascinating how poorly they breathe. and how unlikely it is for them to actually be able to utilize the respiratory system very well. So on the scheme of things, endurance athletes tend to have a system on the spectrum of all athletes towards the upper end. But even with those athletes, like I said earlier, more than 70% of those good breathers are still limiting their performance because of the way that they're breathing. And so as we trickle down to, less well-developed breathers, it becomes more and more important for them to challenge that system.
Yeah. Have you worked with powerlifters by any chance?
So we have a few Olympic lifters using our device, a lot of CrossFitters, a lot of Hydrox athletes in the top, I won't name names, but in the top 10 men and women in the CrossFit Games, we have 7 of those athletes are using our device.
Because I would imagine, maybe my first thought was with a lot of powerlifters, and I don't see any like high level ones, but there's a lot of tendency to hold the breath and kind of create what I would call like a false stability just through, bracing by breath. Yeah. And I think they probably develop a lot of faulty breathing mechanics because of that.
Yeah. It's where we see a lot of like endurance athletes have decent structures, like they have good lung capacity, and they tend to be a little bit weak in their functionality, their ability to utilize that range of motion. Whereas the CrossFit athletes tend to have actually pretty poor structures and have really good utilization. So they can move through their small little tidal volumes really, really well, but they have really poor tidal volumes. And so it depends. This is why it's great to be able to test these athletes and understand that, like, a typical CrossFitter needs to challenge their total range of motion. Can they move their diaphragm more? Whereas an Ironman athlete will typically have reasonable range of motion and have really poor utilization.
When you say range of motion, do you mean like the excursion of the diaphragm? Do you mean the tidal volume? Do you mean their movement of the thoracic cage, or kind of all of the above?
Yeah. So when we talk about the structures versus the functions, the structures are like the total range of motion of the diaphragm. So like in a perfect spirometry style breath, one breath challenge type thing, how much total range do we have to work with? How big is your torso essentially? That's a physical structure that is trainable with range of motion and with osteopathy and stuff like this. Whereas the functionality is like how well you can cycle that, for a minute or for 5 minutes or for an entire Ironman. Can you maintain 70% or more of that total range of motion indefinitely? And so those are the types of numbers that we're looking at from a functional perspective, is like, can these athletes actually use what they got?
Now, I imagine you're pretty familiar with an Inspirometer. Have you kind of put this up against an Inspirometer in terms of, at least in the rehab world? Have you looked at that at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So the original research that we based our work on was based in COPD and asthma and emphysema, that sort of thing. And so we kind of like, commandeered that basic research and took it to the sporting world for performance enhancement. But at the end of the day, these protocols and these tools that we're using are absolutely applicable to people with respiratory disorder.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Yeah, that was where I was going to go next, is COPD and like air trapping and specifically lung scarring. Do you think there's any potential for lung scarring to reverse?
Yeah, like I can only speak anecdotally. We have an undergrad student, a doctoral student at a UBC Vancouver doing some studies on just that right now, to get more like objective data. Anecdotally, we've worked with many people that have gone in and had scarring on X-ray, and 9 months later of using our device are clear. That could be for a whole bunch of different reasons, but I'm happy that we were a part of their healing process.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. Now, I'm very passionate about diabetes, and I deal with a lot of patients with it. Pretty well versed on breathing patterns. and cortisol and excess glucose and chest breathing. And so a big struggle of mine is trying to get people to breathe with their diaphragm rather than their chest.
Yeah.
Because chest is much more sympathetic.
Yep.
So I imagine this is also going to have huge ramifications for diabetes management. Is that something you look at?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about the diabetes space. Like I said, we have people that are using it along those lines. We have a lot of wellness clinics that are using this as part of their service offerings to help people with that, and help with the vasoconstriction of their legs, and help with a little bit better blood flow. So it's certainly a piece of the rehab of diabetes. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see where that goes in the future with more research.
Yeah, just let me clarify that for my listeners. So when you belly breathe, that's much more parasympathetic, whereas your chest breathe is much more sympathetic. When you're in a sympathetic state, your body secretes cortisol, which then turns into glucose, and that tends to lead to shallower breathing, which means you're taking more breaths per minute, which could be, anywhere if you're doing like 10 breaths a minute versus 20, that's the difference is like 10,000 breaths a day versus 30,000 breaths a day.
Yep.
And you can imagine that you're going to have way more glucose in the body, and then that can turn into basically diabetes.
Yeah. Well, this is one of the reasons why we've introduced a mask version of our device, so we can do more nasal work with it, and more of these calming relaxation techniques versus just the high performance sport side. Right? Yeah. It's all encompassing. It's amazing when you start drilling into the benefits, and I'm surprised every day, because like I said, our background is in sport, high performance, and when I get to talk to practitioners about how they're using it to help with diabetes, and how they're using it to help with anti-anxiety and stuff like this, is just incredible.
Yeah, and speaking of respiratory rate, I've been trying to find what is considered ideal. I mean, sort of the textbook that I learned is 12 to 20 breaths per minute. I personally think that sounds kind of high. Have you seen any research on like what's like for the average person ideal resting respiratory rate?
Yeah, I mean, we see a pretty big range between athletes. Certainly with the athletes that have been working with our tool for longer, tend to have a resting respiration rate of like closer to like 6 breaths per minute. Whereas I would say like the norm is like more like 14 breaths per minute.
Yeah. Okay.
Unhealthy would be like 20 breaths per minute.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. Another thing I know that this product is going after is what's called the Metabol Reflex. I'm only kind of like newly learning about this. I think of it, and tell me if I'm wrong here, it's kind of like, reminds me of cold plunging, how your body wants to protect your vital organs, so it kind of shunts blood to the vitals. Yep. That's why your hands or feet get cold. Yep. Is that a similar idea?
Yep. Yeah. So let's say you're out on a run, and your legs are working hard. There's a level of stress there. You push hard enough that your heart and your lungs are going under stress as well. Your central nervous system now has a question posed to it. Where do I send resources to protect the organism? And if your vital organs get pushed to a certain stress load, that central nervous system sees them as being threatened, then it's going to prioritize those vital organs versus the peripheral system. So it's making the decision life over limb, quite literally. And so as we are out there performing in a marathon or 10K or whatever it might be, and the Metabol Reflex kicks in and prioritizes your lung tissues, and so it pushes the blood from your legs to your lungs to make sure that your lungs have what they need to succeed. Your legs then present as feeling tired and heavy. And so you're like, oh, I need to go and train my legs more because my legs are tired. When really, it's your lungs taking the resources away from your legs.
That is fascinating. So if you're doing hill sprints and your legs are fatiguing, it's maybe your respiratory system and not the leg muscles.
It could be, right? And certainly if you're using like a Moxy Monitor and you're monitoring your total hemoglobin response and you're seeing your THB drop, then then you can start to build a pretty strong argument that the Metabol Reflex is taking part.
Wow, crazy. All right, so for the average person that's just getting started out on Isocapnic, who's in, let's just take me, like 45-year-old in decent shape, just wants to improve general like beer league hockey athletic performance, what do you say would be like a good starting point and how to use this product?
Yeah, awesome. So I get everybody to start with the warm-up protocol. It's 5 minutes long. It's super easy. There's nothing nuanced about it. It is like everybody can wrap their heads around the idea of like a dynamic stretching warm-up scenario, right? You're about to go out on a run and you might like do some leg swings or like, you know, some windmill kicks or something to like open up your leg muscles. That's all I'm talking about with a respiratory warm-up. So it's a 5 minute long, starting off at, 15 breaths per minute, and it ramps up towards 30 breaths per minute. So sort of mid-range breathing rates. And the idea is that you're just trying to breathe deeply while the tempo is going faster and faster and faster. And so we're activating that range of motion with more and more power as the 5 minutes goes on. So then when the time comes for you to start your run, that your system is primed, right? It's big and it's full and it's ready to take on whatever ventilatory demands are required. So that's why the warm up is a great place to start, because it's super chill and super easy to execute on. That's on our app for free, no worries. Then we have a bunch of different programs on our app, starting from basic training into more holistic programs where we're building more structures of the respiratory system. And those are specific respiratory training programs that you'll be doing, every morning when you're answering your emails before you get your workout, otherwise done. So let's say your day starts off, in the morning, you answer emails, you might go out for your day of work, and then come back after that and do your workout in the gym, or you do your run or your bike, whatever it might be.
Okay, so there's sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you can pair up the actual respiratory training with like your morning email ritual, and so that you kind of get that training done off your plate, and you get on with the rest of your day as per normal. And your lungs have already received this like super high quality training response already, and so it takes that off your plate, and it's ready to rock.
Okay, so is there different protocols for maybe different activities, like something prior to working out, for example, or maybe for having anxiety or having difficulty sleeping, or is there any protocols for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I just like got off the phone with a practitioner out of France that is running an entire clinic on sleep apnea and using our device to help with sleep apnea. And so she's developing protocols for that. We have protocols for anti-anxiety, protocols for altitude, and all sorts of fun stuff. So depending on what you're looking for, we have different ways to go with it.
Yeah, you mentioned apnea, and that's something I'm definitely very interested in, because I have apnea myself, and I'm desperate to get rid of it. And I talked to, I think it was your partner, Alex, and I think he had mentioned that he'd solved his sleep apnea by using this.
Yeah, like as long as it's like a muscular tone issue, and it's just like a lazy soft palate. What our device does is help like tonify those muscular structures, so you actually get stronger, esophageal reflex, and it doesn't flop as much anymore.
That's awesome.
The other piece is having a better coordination of the diaphragm, so that we have more sinusoidal rhythms of the way that you breathe. And so that way it is a smooth laminar flow of air, and we don't get that that gasping.
When you breathe with the bag, does it provide a little bit of resistance? Is that part of how it trains the muscles?
So inevitably you'll get resistance. When your system requires resistance, the resistance comes in the form of like volume. And the size of our device is around the size of your trachea. And so when you're starting to drive enough volume per second that you're having to actually compress the air through that opening, then that's the resistance you're going to feel. It doesn't make sense to give somebody resistance when they have poor mechanics. And 99% of people that we work with start with having poor mechanics, and that it takes them time to get better mechanics where by the time their mechanics are great, they're breathing hard enough volumes and big enough volumes that their trachea becomes the limiting factor, and that creates the resistance required.
So for the average person that's got faulty mechanics, like, and say they're consistent with it, using it every day, like, what's like a relative time frame do you think that they could expect that to kind of move on to like the next level?
Yeah, so if they are running into like a pretty standard functional limitation, we can see like 4 to 6 weeks a really fast change. So you're doing that like maybe 4 or 5 times a week, working your way up from 5 minutes a day to maybe 30 minutes a day. You'll see over that 4 to 6 weeks a pretty drastic change with the way the system is. If you have more of a osteopathic or structural limitation, then that might take a little bit longer, because structures inherently just take months and years to develop.
Okay. And what about like scoliosis? I mean, I know you get a lot of lung compression scoliosis. Do you think there's any possibility? I mean, I'm familiar with like the Scroth method for breathing to improve scoliosis. Do you think there's some room here for some improvement with scoliosis?
Yeah, I mean, anything that's going to have to do with the activation of the diaphragm and the building of that core stability, absolutely is akin to what we're doing.
Oh, that's awesome. And I got this one's kind of fun too. I have a little note here. I saw on the Instagram feed that you can cure hiccups.
Yeah, so
right?
this was a fun like little side project that Dr. Sellers and I were messing around with. But looking at like the response of the reflex of hiccups, it is very closely tied to your CO2 levels. If we mess with your CO2 levels, we can actually reset that hiccup response. So by doing this protocol that we developed, it's really simple, where we drive low levels of hypercapnia, so CO2 slightly higher. We can reset those pathways and your hiccups will stop.
So
right now,
okay,
we're batting at 100% right now. I'm keen to have somebody do some research on it to see if we can get somebody with chronic hiccups to have this help.
that's interesting, because I had hiccups once for like a week. It was like miserable. So you just slightly elevate the CO2 level. So like holding your breath, I think that's like a thing they say.
It's not even holding your breath. So the problem with holding your breath is that it stops your diaphragm from moving.
Mm-hmm.
And that diaphragmatic range of motion is also a part of the hiccup reflex. And so we need to stretch that range of motion while elevating CO2, which is impossible to do without recapturing your exhaled gases. And so the protocol is really simple. You cover the whole of the device and you breathe big and deep breaths for like a minute. The moment you feel low levels of air hunger or CO2 starts to climb, then you feather the hole. You open up the hole and you finish the minute. And that elevated level of CO2 totally resets that hiccup reflex.
That's really fascinating.
Yep.
All right, so this is kind of my final question for you. Where do you see the future for Isocapnic?
Oh gosh, we have a whole bunch of different directions that we are planning on going. Our ultimate goal is to make respiratory training available, like high-level respiratory training available for everyone. And so that's why our device is priced in a way that is accessible to people. That's why our app is free. That's why we try to get this stuff, we try to push as much information out into the ether as we can to help people leverage this totally underutilized, this totally taught methodology. Like, it is incredibly well studied, but really poorly taught. And we really want to like help people understand the value of how important, respiratory training is and should be. Where we want to go is like creating better and better methodologies, creating like pairing up with more practitioners around the world to deliver top level training protocols and therapy protocols for people of all different backgrounds, whether it's COPD and asthma or emphysema or high performance rugby or high performance golf, or we're starting to work with like special ops snipers now, which is blowing my mind. Really, really cool stuff. So I don't know what the future has in store, but if it requires heavy breathing, we are all in.
I love it. I can see it in a few years from now, like on the sidelines, all the athletes just using your tool and getting warmed up, maybe between sets or reps or whatever. I can see that happening.
Yeah, I mean, we're actually seeing actual like performance gains in using the device between intervals. So let's say like you're like on, you said you're in beer league hockey. We're actually seeing our hockey players performing better when they come off the ice between shifts, and they're using the bag on the bench between shifts. And our working hypothesis right now is that instead of you coming off the ice in a vasodilated state, and then you breathing off all that CO2 and vasoconstricting down, and then you're going back out on the ice and then having to recharge up that system, you're hitting the ice fully charged already, while your muscular system is already rested. So you have full bore prime system with rested muscles, which is a awesome combination.
So if you're haven't played beer league hockey, I'm asking for a friend, in about a year, and you're about to go play, and you do your first shift, and you're gasping for air that first shift, do you think this could help you catch your breath a little faster?
So if you are using it in training, absolutely. If you're using it in training, you're then developing a respiratory system that can handle higher demands. Where you would normally be limited by 100 liters or 120 liters per minute, we can now train you to be 200 or 250 liters per minute. So that respiratory system is just not a limiting factor anymore.
That's really cool. I'm going to tell my whole hockey team's going to be using this. All right, Luke. Well, that's the last question I had for you. This is a really exciting product. Is there anything else I missed or anything else you want to talk about?
Hey man, like we're an open book. Like I said, we are steeped in this process of practical coaching and in the trenches, working with people every single day. And so we are more than happy to answer questions and converse with people about how they're limited and how we can help them. What's the best way for people to connect with you and your team? Probably easiest way is on our Instagram handle. So it's Isocapnic on Instagram there. Or you can just find us on the website, isocapnic.com. Okay, perfect. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. Thank you. No problem. Thanks.